Please welcome Phil Pelletieri, Distinguished Faculty Associate Emeritus from UW's Department of Entomology. As we've advertised, you're going to find out all about bugs that are coming our way soon. Phil?
Before I get started, just a little background, because with the name Pelletieri, yes, I did drive a garbage truck. I grew up in Madison. Both my dad and my uncle owned businesses, and that's how I worked through the university, both as in high school and university as my summer job. My dad wanted me to take over the business because he said, son, there will always be garbage. I said, Dad, after working on the trucks, I know there's always going to be bugs, so I'm not worried. So I want to share today a little bit about some things that are coming, some things that are here. But one finds, with running the lab for 36 years, you get a perspective, and I'm going to hopefully share some of my perspective on the insect world. But I'm going to start out with a full disclosure comment. Everybody knows this is an earwig, but I will tell you, growing up in Madison, there were no earwigs. And when I started in 1978, there were no earwigs in Madison. And being as wise an entomologist as I was, the only place we could find them is along the lakeshore in Milwaukee. And I said, well, that's the lake effect, the milder climate because of the lake, not realizing it would only take them a little time to get here. And they showed up here in the early 80s. I remember specifically doing an article with the Capital Times and went out of my way to say that they don't go in your ear. And 2 days later, in letters to the editor, a woman who went to the doctor to get one removed from her ear told me to stick it in my ear. So I've been very careful. So again, I will go back to that perspective. I made the prediction that it was lake effect. They weren't going to get here. They're in Ashland now, so we'll give you some idea. So we have between 25 to 28,000 different species recorded in the state, which is a nice hefty number, but kind of boring in the insect world because we're dealing with literally millions of species. But perspective-wise, only 1 to 2% you define as a pest, and that's in kind of a loose term, anything that causes an unintended consequence, you could call it as a pest. And then what ecologically is very intriguing is 70% of what we define as a pest is not native here. So there are things out of place, and that seems to be commonplace whether you talk weeds or you name it. But there's another phenomenon going on. Native invaders are insects that belong in the U.S., but are changing their ranges because of climate issues. And one of my favorite lines to use on the radio is that the governor moved us to Missouri about 10 years ago and didn't tell us, because there are so many insects that did not appear in Wisconsin when I was a kid, or even when I started in the lab, that are now found as far north as Wisconsin Dells and farther. And I will share some of those with you. And I think the biggest effect to this is the lack of distinctive cold weather in the winter, allowing things to move northward. Now, this winter is an interesting one. I will make a couple comments on that. Normally, I think people overplay winter factors because so many of my insects are spending their time in the ground or in other sheltered cases, so they're really not seeing the kind of ambient air temperatures that we are reacting to and the like. So. And the other thing with insects, if I were to make a winter or a weather prediction, what I usually find is if you warm things up in the spring and wake them up and then slam the door, then you get an impact. So the spring has more of an impact to me than the winter in most cases. Now, the other side of it is just with the way the world works and things being imported and the like, we are constantly seeing new non-native, and by non-native meaning not even to North America, in most cases, insects being introduced. And if I go through and look at all my records, it's 2 to 3 to 4 a year it was expected. And some of these turn out not to be significant pests, so we don't really worry about it. I'm sure there are a number of them that get introduced that we don't pick up for a very, very long time because they're not causing problems and the like, so that's really quite interesting to watch. One of the other blessings is a lot of these things come from the coast, so we see they're rather well understood in most cases before they get here, which is great for being an entomologist here. There's real reasons why I would never be an entomologist in Florida, because if you look at how many invasives they get in a year, and you never have this blessed winter or weather to stop them 6 months a year, and so it gets pretty crazy down there. Okay, and then the other comment about exotics is it has been observed by many people, and it came to I came to the conclusion that in most cases exotics are most problematic when they first get introduced and they mellow out over time. I've seen that happen with Japanese beetle here in my own yard, and as I said, for the most part, that is the trend. So even if I come up with some new major headache, over time you think that things will get to a point that they will be less of a problem, and most of the times quite substantially less of a problem. So, some examples of some native things. Oh, I see. I'm sorry about this. I'm one slide off on you guys. This is an imperial moth. When I was a kid, I would have traded you my bike and my sister for one of these. And what's interesting about it, the insect itself, the caterpillars feed on oak. So we have plenty of oak here. But apparently what the limiting factor was, it overwinters in the ground as a pupal case, or in the pupal stage, and it was just too cold. But all of a sudden, in the last 20 to 30 years, they became quite commonplace. This one I took a picture of out in Verona, but I had a specimen come in from Bascom Hill, where somebody found this beautiful large moth, brought it into the lab as an imperial moth. So this is an example of an insect that I figure that, again, the lack of significant cold weather in the winter has allowed it to extend its range northward. Now, an example of a non-native that has decided to set up housekeeping in the state is the praying mantid. There are no native mantids in the upper Midwest. There are some species both in the Southwest and Southeast, but the two mantids that we see most often are non-natives. One is the Chinese mantid, which is pictured here, and there's also a European mantid. And what was the limiting factor for these is mantids spend the winter in this golf ball-sized egg case called an ootheca. It is kind of soft and spongy, and once in a while we would get plant material that had ootheca on them from down south, and they'd be shipped up to Wisconsin. They would hatch, and so occasionally we would get a mantid coming to maturity, but the problem was is if they found a mate, laid an egg, the egg masses would not survive the normal winter temperatures that we see. Until about 10 years ago. I can't tell you, as I was finishing up my career in the lab, the number of mantid species, specimens that people would bring in from Madison. And we know for a fact now that mantids have been breeding in the southern third of the state and in Door County. Now again, probably the temperate climate of Door County might have allowed it. This is one that will be interesting to see if the winter does have a knockback effect, because this egg mass is out and exposed. And at 30 below, you got the feeling that it probably would have been pretty tough on them. But I think it's a matter of time, if this didn't work, that they would move upwards. And this is what it looks like when you get hatching time. And one of the sad things about a mantid's biology is they eat their brothers and sisters. They're cannibalistic, but that's another story. Now, if you have a burning bush, this insect, I remember the first time I saw it. Again, I don't know if I'd say highlight or low light of my career when I'd see something brand new. Euonymus webworm, I remember the first specimens of this European species I saw came in from Waukesha County from an arborist that found it in state record. We were quite excited. It only feeds on plants in the Euonymus genus. So aside from burning bush, wahoo is one of our native species of Euonymus. And the insect hatches in the spring, and you get these herds of little worms. And by herds, there are no leaves left on this plant. There are literally thousands of worms crawling down from it. And the plant itself looks like, you do this in October for Halloween, you put the stuff on, but this is bug related. Now, a great part of the story, this was up on University Avenue. One of our graduate students took this picture. Phil got all excited. I was going to run up there with my camera. Just about the time I opened the door of Russell Labs, the thunder started. Okay, can't do it today, do it tomorrow. I go up there the next day, and I look for the tree. It is gone. The grounds crew cut the tree down. And the sad news, if you're, into gardening, you know that when you defoliate plants early in the season, they will leaf out again. This was just a cosmetic problem. But the interesting thing about this insect, it spends the winter as very tiny caterpillars on the twigs. So it, again, seems to be very sensitive to weather. And so I'd see, you get a halfway cold winter and they would get pushed back to Milwaukee. And then all of a sudden we get a couple, 3 warmer winters and they'd show up in Madison. I had tracked them all the way to Monroe County, Greene County, excuse me, in the city of Monroe. And then this picture came in from Green Bay. But the one that really knocked my socks off was this hedge in Duluth. I was humbled when I saw this insect had made it all the way up to Duluth and survived the winters. And so, as I said, another example of watching and tracking something. Another one is magnolia scale. Now, magnolia, when I grew up in the city, was always kind of a marginally hardy plant. You could get them to grow, but more often than not, the winters were severe enough that they got knocked back pretty good. You get some dieback and you wouldn't get good flowering. Well, the last 20 or 30 years, they have really done quite well. Well, when they weren't doing well, we didn't see many insect problems because they didn't seem to be able to survive very well. But now, if you have a magnolia, the curse you will get is something called a magnolia scale. It is a plant sap-feeding insect, and along about the middle of July, you start seeing this white flocculence, which makes your plant look like it's attacked by cotton candy. Now, at this time, this is the maturing of the scale. It will turn each one of these white blobs turn into an egg sac. And the way their life cycle goes is those eggs hatch in the end of August, and these little tiny scales run around the plant. Now, the problem, when you visually see the problem, you want to react. So most people would spray in July when it starts to get this white fuzziness on the plant. The proper time to kill the critter is in September when they're little tiny ones that are on the plant. And so a lot of people would attempt control and be very dissatisfied with it because their timing was off. And it's kind of weird worrying about insects in September. Most of the insects we have to treat, we worry about in the spring of the year. And that's what the crawlers look like. They're really very small, really remind you more of mites than anything else. But what these things do, they're like an aphid. They process excess amounts of plant sap, and then they secrete this real sticky substance we call honeydew. It's real tacky, and the leaves look shiny. You might have seen this when scale attacks your house plants, you get the same kind of symptoms. And then from there is a black mold that grows on it. So here's a picture somebody sent in. They had a magnolia tree, and all that blackness on the sidewalk, aside from the sidewalk being so sticky you wouldn't want to walk on it, is this black fungus growing on the honeydew that the scales have secreted. So it's really kind of an eyesore, and it will cause significant dieback on the trees because it weakens them so much. One of the other problems is this sooty mold will cover the leaves, and the leaves start to yellow because the sunlight can't get to them. It's a real interesting interaction. So again, with magnolia doing better, somehow magnolia scale decided to go from being a non-issue to a major problem on magnolia. And so a lot of plants have had to be treated, and because it's kind of tricky sometimes, people have had to hire professional people to come in and the like. So it's really been quite curious watching this one go. And what I've always been intrigued with is the insect in the adult female stage is a egg sac, basically. It can't walk, it can't fly. But the way this insect disperses is those little crawlers hitchhike on birds, which is a great way to jump from tree to tree. This one. My colleague Susan Paskowitz and I have had fun talking about this. This is the Lone Star tick. Lone Star ticks are typically something you find from Missouri southward. I'll show you a range map in a second. The females are quite distinctive because they've got one little dot on the back. And as the name implies, you do find Lone Star ticks down in Texas. But what historically we see is, I'd see maybe 1, maybe 2 specimens a year scattered throughout the state. They were only adults, and there was never any evidence of them breeding. What we speculated is they would be hitchhiking up on birds, one got dropped off, and then somebody found it. But we never saw alternate life stages, immature ticks and the like. Well, things have changed somewhat with that, in that the immature ticks, which are often, if you're down in Missouri, people call them seed ticks. Because if you're out having a picnic and you put your blanket in the wrong place, you can pick up 50 to 100 seed ticks just like that. Part of it has to do with the way the females lay their eggs in one big cluster, and so you've got all these baby ticks running around. And the northern range was about the Wisconsin-Illinois border at best. So as I said, we would have records of them being brought into the state, but there were no records of them breeding in the state until the last 10 to 15 years. And it turns out some of this came to us from some of the work that was done on Lyme disease and the ticks associated with mice. We were discovering they were scattered throughout the state, and some of these are just my old isolated records. But what's more important is when we're finding immature stages, which is suggesting they're breeding here. And they have been found breeding in the Arboretum. Now, what makes Lone Star tick quite interesting among, all we need is another vector diseases, but it has been discovered recently that certain individuals who are bitten by Lone Star ticks develop an allergy to meat, to red meat. Not a lot of people, but some, and that's not an allergy most people want to deal with, of course, and so all of a sudden we're quite excited. Now again, it will be interesting. This range extension, I'm sure has something to do with the lack of cold weather, but ticks are one group of animals I do not expect that 30-degree ambient air temperature, or minus 30, to affect, because they're down in a litter, dormant. And if they're there, there's probably this much snow on top of them, so I don't expect any kind of knockback to the Lone Star tick populations. Now, as long as we're talking about ticks, I at least have to mention, on a national basis, the one that's caught our attention the last 2 or 3 years is a new Asian species called the Asian longhorn tick. It gets its name from the fact that up on the hypostome, which is what we would call a head, but it's nothing like our head, it has these little spines that stick out. This was discovered in New Jersey about 4 years ago. And I will tell you, I think the reason it was not discovered sooner is because we have an almost identical looking species on rabbits. Same genus, different species, has those funny little barbs there. And so if anybody were to pick it up without a host record, you would say, but the rabbit tick is exclusive to rabbits. And when they started finding it on dogs, cows, and people, it got their attention. Then they discovered it's not a native species, it's an Asian species. By the time we discovered it was something new and they looked around, records come in from about 5 or 6 states now. And because ticks are pretty efficient vectors of various diseases, it turns out there's a couple potential diseases that this may bring into play and the like. But biologically, and this is not an unusual trait when you bring an invasive in, is this species is capable of breeding without any males being present. And we see that in ants, I see that in hornets. As I said, this is a rather common trait for invasive insects, to be able to reproduce without normal sexual reproduction. And so this is a range map of the potential areas we expect the tick to be able to be successful in. And as you see, Wisconsin is in that realm, even though it's a ways away from here. But it wouldn't surprise me if you told me somebody found one this summer. It wouldn't knock my socks off. I think, you know, it just has such a potential there, so we're going to have one more tick to deal with. Now, I was always intrigued professionally. If you ask me what was one of the most intriguing stories in my career, deer ticks and Lyme disease. I mean, just a fascinating interaction. And in the first deer tick, and that's the one here on our left, was in Wisconsin, was captured in 1969 by one of our students who was doing a survey of parasites of mice up in Spooner. And there had been various tick surveys done before that, and we never picked this critter up. And if you track both the movement of the tick and the incidence of Lyme disease in the state, and this is even pre-Lyme disease being described, It all started in that northwest corner and then kind of spread out from there. Now the tick on the right is the old-fashioned, what we all grew up calling a wood tick, but to an entomologist is officially a American dog tick. Now, some confusion, but with the aid of modern technology, I was always intrigued, where the devil did this tick come from? You have to, well, it turns out that there was a species that we call the black-legged tick that was native to Texas and elsewhere. And through looking at DNA, we can now speculate that the ticks that we've got in Wisconsin originated from ticks that lived in Texas. But if you look at the relatively recent geological history of this state, what you can find is that at the Ice Age, we didn't have any deer ticks, we didn't have any deer, we didn't have anything moving around here. So what had to happen is we had to recolonize the state. Now again, because ticks can hitchhike on birds, it's not hard to see what the possibility, but you need one male, one female to be dropped off the same spot so you can start the reproduction. But I was always intrigued, what was lacking? What took it so long? Well, I had the opportunity to talk to one of the people at CDC that was working quite a bit with this, and it all has to do with deer and deer densities. That the deer densities were too low for an awful long time. But in the last century, of course, the deer population skyrocketed. That was probably the key factor that allowed them to establish and flourish. And studies out east, where there also is an issue with this tick and Lyme disease, has shown us that if you isolate and reduce the deer populations on islands, isolated islands, you will control the tick population. Now that's not practical here, but it shows you that interrelationship of certain critical deer densities and this particular tick. So the other side of it, of course, is the vectoring of various diseases. And what this deer tick is, or what is officially called the black-legged tick, what it has going for it is it's a very efficient bridge of feeding on rodents, particularly mice, picking up various organisms and then transferring it to humans, dogs, and other animals. So it's a bridge. And it's much more efficient than the other species. And if you look at the number in cases of diseases, remember, was utterly in shock when CDC came out and told us that we were only reporting 10% of the cases of Lyme disease that were really going on. This was about 6 years ago that they got that kind of handle on. So we're talking thousands of cases of a arthropod-borne disease in Wisconsin. Now as a student, you know, you study about all these weird things in Africa, but you just didn't expect to see that kind of cases here. And it's not just Lyme, it's anaplasmosis, it's babesiosis, Powassan virus. As I said, there really is a long list of things. And it continues to increase as the percentage of disease increases in the rodent population. There is this correlation. The mice pick it up, spread it, the ticks pick it from that, and then spread it to us. So enough ticks. We don't want to scare you any more than we have. One of the reasons Phil retired. When we would get these invasive insect plagues, you know, people had a lot of frustrations with them. Asian lady beetle was one, and in trying to get people to understand the biological facts is often somewhat difficult and the like. So I knew this one was coming. And it's particularly pertinent to talk about it in Madison because right now the hot spot for marmorated brown stink bug is Madison. But this is an Asian species that was picked up in Pennsylvania, at least in numbers, in the late 1990s. Our first records go back to 2010. I remember it vividly because I knew what was going on out east and was not expecting. And I remember I was giving a talk, and it was to a pest control conference, you know, people that do pest control around your house. And one of the people came up afterwards with a little bottle. And these were picked off a hotel, the outside of a hotel in the spring in Madison on the east side. And knew right away what it was. They sprayed for it. We talked to the Department of Ag because this would be a new intercept for them. And they went there and they couldn't find them. And we didn't hear anything for a couple, 3 years. But all of a sudden it is taken off. And The way I explain this insect, the nuisance value is much like Asian lady beetle because of its home invasion issues, but it also is a pest of fruit and vegetables. We haven't quite seen that yet. And it looks like our native brown stink bugs, but it has a distinctive banding on the antenna. In our native brown stink bugs, if you look at them closely on their shoulders, it looks like a comb. It's got all these little teeth. The Asian species has a very smooth margin. But when they feed on your apples, they ruin your apples. If they feed on your tomatoes, they ruin your tomatoes. They cause a little white spot we call a ghost spot. And you don't want to mess with Wisconsin people's tomatoes. I mean, of anything that people hold dear is if you're growing tomatoes in your backyard, anything. And for the most part, we can get things through. So we're going to have to deal with the damage. They feed on raspberries, a number of things. But the other side is they invade houses. And what we have not seen the levels yet that they do out east. And I remember talking to a person who lived in Maryland, and she told me that their shop vac, they burned out the motor because they were sucking so many of these in. And the other things, if you bother them, I'm sure if you picked one up and tried to take it gently outside, you notice that they leave an odor. Well, imagine if you've got a few thousand of them. They leave an odor that sometimes takes a few days to dissipate. And so it's just not, so that's their habit. In the fall of the year, they invade houses. I think I've probably taken 15 or 20 of them out of our house, which is relatively boring compared to these numbers. For whatever reason, the Vilas Park neighborhood seems to have been the most intense infestation we've seen yet to date. Although I will tell you now we have records from about 15 to 18 counties. So they are continuing to spread, and we're seeing most of these from these fall invasions, not so much with the crop damage yet, which is really quite interesting to watch. So, kind of stay tuned. In the scheme of things, it hasn't got as bad as fast as I was expecting. I probably could work for another couple of years. But it turns out that, as I said, it's a frustrating insect, because I don't have any easy answers. There are some sprays you can put on the outside of the house, but people would rather not spray, and even those are not as effective as some people would like. When you get invasive insects like that, and if they're coming in by the thousands, and I give you a control strategy that kills 90%, I feel like a hero. But if you still have a few hundred in your house, you're not going to be happy. I understand that. Okay, some other little friends. This was a viburnum that had been planted on the Epic grounds over in Verona. And the insect damage is so distinctive that when I was sent the image, I knew we were up to. And if that's all the insect did, I wouldn't be so concerned, but then eventually it goes like this. So normally when my insects chew the leaves off plants, they survive, but when this insect gets the better of them, they can cause mortality in some, not all varieties of viburnum. Animals called the viburnum leaf beetle, just a little brown, nondescript beetle, but it lays its eggs on the twigs. That's how this insect gets through the winter. And somehow, in fact, this was an intriguing case, the one in Epic. Again, when you get an insect that is brand new, we get the Department of Ag people out and we sit and talk. And it was said that the plants that they got from the nursery came from Minneapolis, up in Minnesota. That didn't make sense because the insect had not been discovered in that state, but this insect has been bothering the Northeast in particular. Well, when they really got investigating, there was plants from Ohio that were shipped up to Minneapolis and then shipped down here. But what happened is once it was discovered, they were more than willing to destroy all the plants on the property. Department of Ag came back for the next year or two and checked the area, could not find any evidence of the insect, so we knocked it back. And then since I've retired, my colleague PJ Leash, who now runs the diagnostic lab, has said that we have found it in 3 counties, in Milwaukee, Waukesha, and Washington. So it is established in that part of the state. So it's coming. And so what it does is it takes a plant that is basically low maintenance to no maintenance viburnum and making it one you're going to have to spray every year. Most of us don't like that kind of stuff in the garden. So this was a bit of a disappointment. And kind of stay tuned. And as I said, the damage is distinctive enough, when you see that kind of feathery feeding, get suspicious, and this will happen in particularly June. Another unfortunate introduction is this really rather attractive beetle. It's called a lily leaf beetle, and the first ones were picked up in Wausau for some reason in 2014. Again, it's an animal that has been established out east and in Canada, but it was our first records. And it's primarily a pest of Asiatic lilies that we have in our garden. And it's a leaf-chewing insect. It does something that's quite common with this beetle family, where the larvae will literally defecate on themselves as a protective device. And what they honestly look like is a bird dropping. They don't look like an insect, but if you go in that little shiny thing and jab, there is a fat little larvae feeding inside. They eat the tissue off of it and the like. And so from that original introduction, they spread down in the Stevens Point area, and I've heard of one record being now verified in the southwest part of the state. And we'll see where that goes, but you know, it's only a matter of time. When you look at, again, this is the clearest of map, but you see the extensive introduction in establishment out east, and now we're starting to get here, and then we got the one down in Illinois. And it will continue to probably spread. Even though plants are supposed to be inspected when they go from one state to the next, you know, at times things, for various reasons, are not. This critter, at first glance, will remind you of a whole bunch of things that are either native or related exotic species that have been here. This is the European paper wasp. And our first records in the Madison area go back probably now about 8 or 9 years ago. Now, in the paper wasp group, we think of the things like the yellow jackets that can make these huge nests that are covered. We call it an envelope. So you see this big gray carton, and then inside are the individual cells. Whereas the Polistes paper wasps, the group that this comes from, make those much smaller ones, and you can see the cells when you look at them, and they're usually on your overhangs. That's where they love to be. And they're relatively small in numbers compared to the yellow jackets. We're talking maybe 35, 40 individuals. And we've always had a native species. And the native one, if you look, has those kind of reddish-brown legs, the little bit of reddish-brown markings in the abdomen. And for the most part, most of us evolve with these things and realize that if there's a nest, you leave it alone and things are fine. I mean, most paper wasps are pretty docile unless the nest is threatened. These are usually pretty obvious and out in the open. So it's rather subtle to see that the European species looks very similar, except you notice that the legs don't have quite the brownish. In particular, there's none of that brownish marking around the abdomen. What these look like are those yellow jackets, but about half again as big. What's different biologically about these things is they love to hide their nests. So here we have a sundial that is up against the wall of the house. You don't think there's any problem. You go and you bump it all of a sudden. Or I'll tell you my first experience here, and even though my colleague Bob Jean had told us they were here, because he and his students were observing them moving in from out east in the eastern counties into Madison. I was up on a ladder cleaning out my eaves. And I put my hand up there, and all of a sudden, bang, I got zapped. What was that, you know? And I look up there, I don't see anything, and I go up there again, and I see two coming for me, and at least I was smart enough to get my hand out of the way. They had set up the nest behind the flashing up there, and so when I was tapping on the flashing, they were not happy. You think I would learn. This past summer, I was up on the roof checking my roof vents because we had, every once in a while, we get some strange animal crawling into in the attic, which keeps us up at night, and that's not good. So I was checking to make sure everything was screened, and I put my hand in one of those in August, and bang, I got zapped again. And I'm thinking, you dummy. Because if they're going to have a nest, it's going to be in a protected site. Another classic place. This, again, my old house, and the shutter's up underneath. And as long as you don't mess with them, they're fine. But if I'm out there, you know, raking or painting or whatnot, and I start pounding on things, they get upset. In fact, this was interesting. Again, if you don't bother much, I took this picture. Those are basically the guards. It's not really what's going on, but they're there defensively, and they're just kind of watching, you know. And as long as things, and of course the waist caught my attention. Sorry about that. You can see the waist spots. That's how I knew they were there. So this one's notorious for putting things behind. And the other thing interesting biologically, well, two things interesting biologically. They are displacing our native species. They're outcompeting them. They're just pushing them out, which is quite intriguing. But the other thing is that most of the time, the way Polistes starts their nests are queens that spend the winter and start everything from scratch in the spring, and most of the establishment is in May. I swear to you that these things will try to establish a nest as late as August. So for some reason, they're capable of really going much later. And this one really caught me. This is the gas cap door of my car. And I went, you know, I gas up once every 10 days or so, not all that much. In the interim, from the last time I did it to this time I did it, one started a 3 or 4 cell nest in there. And we hear this quite a bit. A car that's sitting for 3 or 4 weeks, people aren't paying attention, it's not started, then somebody starts the engine up and they got a bunch of very angry Polistes wasps. So that's one of the major changes with this species, is it just isn't out in the open for people to be able to react to, and for that reason, you are more likely to get stung. And where it goes now, the good news, there's always a good news side of things. If you've ever had little green worms on your broccoli and cabbage, these things love to eat those. They're predators. So they're very efficient at picking up caterpillar larvae in particular. Okay. Now this one, if you've seen, and there's quite a few of these on campus now, this is cicada killer. Same black and yellow coloring, but this thing is about 1.5 inches long. It's the jacket you have ever seen, but it's not a yellow jacket. As the name implies, this thing stings and paralyzes cicadas. And it will carry that cicada, it has to dig a burrow, it will bury the cicada in the burrow, it will lay its egg, and the egg it lays will turn into a male or female depending on how good the food source is. The female can figure this out. If there's a lot of food, she will lay a female egg. If there's not a lot of food, she lays a male. Insects do some really amazing things. When I was a kid, you had to go to Indianapolis to find cicada killers. There just were no cicada killers that I knew of in Madison and the like. And now, as I said, they're really quite common on campus. This one was taken over by Vilas Hall. They had some ornamentals there that weren't mulched very well. I saw them flying back and forth. I knew that something was going on there. And then you stopped and looked, and sure enough, there was the burrow. There was the cicada that they had gotten. So you don't see these until well into the end of July when the cicadas come out. The males cannot sting, but they're very territorial. So if you're close to an area where there has been some sting, they will come out and stare you right in the face. And most people will read that as a very aggressive reaction. They're just checking you out. But when you tell that to people, it's hard to get them to settle down on it. I understand. The other thing is, this is technically a solitary wasp in that they make the burrows, they drop the cicadas there, and they got nothing to do with it. So there's nothing to defend. The yellow jackets and wasps that give us troubles are the ones that live in colonies that do have a true nest and a queen and the like. And those are the ones that are aggressive, because when their nest is threatened, they take great offense at that. So it's relatively innocuous one, but it scares the living heck out of people. And as I said, it's been interesting to watch. So I know we've got records now up in the Dells. I know we got records up north of Milwaukee. This continues to extend its range. We got cicadas all the way up to Ashland, so it won't surprise me eventually that they'll make their way up that way if these climate issues continue. Okay. I never run out of bugs. That's one of the problems. But this one was came about the same time that the brown marmorated Asian stink bug came. We have over 100 species verified Drosophila or fruit flies. But this one has a very unique spot on its wings. That's where the name comes, spotted winged Drosophila or spotted winged fruit fly. But it also has a very distinctive biology that has changed things. Now, typically, when you find fruit flies in your house, and you were to call me, I would say, you know, they might be flying around the bananas on the kitchen table, but that's not where they're breeding. Because fruit fly maggots must feed on yeast that's associated with overly ripe, overly decay, fermenting things. But then the adults are attracted to anything. So again, you got a glass of wine, they dive bomb in your wine. I remember back when my kids were small, we used to have one day in summer where the kids were allowed to have sugared Kool-Aid. And my daughter forgot that she had half a cup of sugar Kool-Aid downstairs in the basement. This eventually, of course, evaporated, and I bred 37 fruit flies out of that cup. Between the sugar, and as it fermented, and the yeast associated with it, that was what the larvae were feeding on. So, you know, I tell that story to people just to kind of think of the kind of things you might expect to find as the fruit fly source. But it's always overly ripe, decaying stuff. Well, it turns out this thing, aside from spreading through the U.S. in a very short period of time, only a couple years really, is primarily a plant of fruits. And as I had mentioned, the males are really quite distinctive. They've got these little dots on them. But that's not what got our attention. Is people would go to pick their raspberries, and you bring it in the house and you open it up, it's got maggots in there. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Now, usually if the raspberry was so rotten you wouldn't pick it, and you told me if you found a fruit fly maggot in there, that doesn't surprise me. But these are prime picking time berries. Well, what the spotted-winged Drosophila has is an egg-laying device that is like a saw, which allows her to lay the eggs into the fruit before it even colors. Very smart on the insect's part because it's got no competitors at that time. And so the maggots attack, and I will be honest with you, I strongly suspect that they're carrying their own yeasts with them, which aids in the breakdown and fermenting of the fruit. I mean, that just makes a lot of sense to me. And so when you look back at it, we've had problems on strawberries, raspberries in particular. Of any crop that has taken the biggest hit in the state, it's been raspberries. Strawberries in Wisconsin seem to be able to get ripe and picked before this thing gets going, which begs the question, what the devil are they doing in June? I don't know. We haven't figured that one out totally. We do know they survive the winter. We were absolutely terrified at the potential of cranberry pest. We don't need any more cranberry pests. It doesn't get in cranberries. What it comes down to is thick-skinned fruit, they can't get their egg-laying device in. But thinner skinned stuff like a raspberry, like a blueberry, even cherries, that's what they will attack. And so in order to stop this, if you're producing those crops, you have to start spraying as soon as the fruit starts to mature in color, which means additional 3-4 applications of insecticides, which is not what most people want to do. So a lot of commercial raspberry people have just said it's not worth it. And honestly, with that in mind, kind of suggests if you're going to get in that business, you have to realize that it's kind of a whole new game. So with that in mind, I've talked to my colleagues in horticulture and said, oh, I've got the answer. If you guys can come with a thick-skinned raspberry, we'll stop this insect. They don't seem real excited about that opportunity for some reason, but it does suggest that there may be some physical ways to slow it down. Okay. This is some damage on cherries. I've been a bit of an issue, but of course the cherry industry in Door County is not what it used to be. This would have been even far more severe of an issue 40 years ago. Now this one's not here yet. This is it's on the radar screen from people out east and the like here talking. It's called a spotted lanternfly, and when I first look at it, it's kind of an attractive insect, I think. You know, in fact, when I see an insect like that, if you didn't tell me the background, I'd say, well, that's something from the jungles or from Asia, because for some reason they have just nicer looking insects than we do, or showier. But the lanternfly, unfortunately, it's an aphid-like creature, sucks the juices out of plants. It will go after grapes, fruit trees, so it's also basically an ornamental pest. Its main host is Ailanthus, which is a tree of heaven, which is considered an invasive tree. And I historically remember seeing some of these in town, but if you told me to find one now, I'm not so sure I could. But as far as where it's established, it's now picked up and verified in 4 states. They're wrestling with it. Again, when it starts going after some of the commercial stuff like grapes, all of a sudden we get into a bigger issue and the like. Some models, though, suggest we may be, at least now, saved by our location being a little far north, but let's wait and see. I remember, again, one of these be truthful moments, Japanese beetle, which has been such a curse. Our first records were in the 60s in Kenosha, and it died out, and we used a blessed Wisconsin winter theory again. Well, this infestation that we've dealt with in the last 2.5 or 30 years or so, I remember the call coming in from the Beloit area of some insect eating everything in sight. Department of Ag people went down there. It was Japanese beetle. We were very disappointed to see that, among other things. And we had a 28 below that year, and it didn't phase them one bit. So forget the winter theory on that one too. So we'll see on this one, but this just shows you the range map so far of where it has been detected. And the problem with this one, it appears that it's spread much like that critter on viburnum. The egg masses are laid on the plant and on the twigs, and you can see these. And so again, if you were careful on moving stuff and making sure it didn't have eggs, it wouldn't be transported, but it's also kind of subtle, so I can say people will miss it. Okay, and then the last one, just because probably next to the Lyme disease and deer tick story, bed bugs has become a very interesting story and something that's misunderstood. Now, I will tell you as a biologist, the first thing is that they're just indoor mosquitoes. There's some real similarities. They must feed on blood. The other interesting thing is bed bugs have never been documented to transmit any human disease, which is extremely interesting because any other thing that feeds on blood seems to be capable or competent to transmit something. But when you say people that they have bed bugs, they are just freaked. But most of us are old enough to remember our grandmothers or even our parents talk about bed bugs. And I will tell you that pre-1940, it was figured that probably 30% of the households in the US were dealing with bed bugs at one time or another. So they're relatively commonplace. But for the longest time, whoever saw them, it was so exciting when I saw a human bed bug, I would run out to our secretaries in the department and play show and tell. Now, I'm sure they didn't appreciate it, but it was really, really quite a treat for me to see a human bed bug early in my career. And then I remember it was probably just about the late 90s, I went to one of the national meetings, and we went from 2 papers on bed bugs one year to 2 symposium on bed bugs the next year. And I told my wife, they will take over the world. And the ultimate is, you've made it in the insect world when they name candy after you. And there's an interesting story. If I get time, I'll tell you about this in particular. So, what's going on here? There were obligatory mammal feeder. They're relatively host specific. The bed bugs we're dealing with now are related to species that attack bats. And there is a bat bug. When people used to send me bed bugs, it wasn't human bed bug, it was bat bed bugs. And the only way I could tell them the difference is by the length of the hairs on their body. Big science here. If the hairs are longer than the width of the eye, it's a bat bug. If they're less than the width of the eye, they're a human bed bug. I always love that character to get them. So, as I said, historically, now you think about our ancestors. There was no bed bugs in North America until the Europeans came. But we think the countries of origin were basically in Northern Europe. But if we go back far enough, our ancestors lived in caves with the bats and the bat bugs. So is it surprising that bugs evolved into human feeders? No, it's not at all. And what knocked the Decans out of them is DDT. The advent of DDT almost, it didn't eradicate, but bed bugs became such a non-issue. Now, one of the things about DDT, if you sprayed it in somebody's bedroom, it's killing bugs for 10 years. I mean, the residual life was just extended to a point that even if things got introduced. interesting enough, people say, well, bring back DDT. The first resistance to DDT was seen in 1947 in bedbug populations. So they were already resistant. And one of the stunning things is one of the reasons their problem now is the mechanism that the bedbugs use to prevent DDT from killing them also prevents our newer insecticides from working, which is really quite intriguing. But when they bite, it's kind of like a mosquito bite, but it might be delayed by as much as 2 to 3 days. Also, some of us don't react. I have yet to have a bedbug even give me a pink spot when I've allowed one to feed on me. That seems to be more common as you get older, to be less susceptible. But then there's the other side, is some people who get susceptible will get literally evolve into open sores that last for extended periods of time, so people can become allergic to them, is really what it comes to. Now, when I go into a hotel room, the first thing I do is lift back the sheets and look for signs of bedbugs' presence, which are the black waste spots that they leave. And typically it'll be along the seam of the mattress. If you really want to get carried away in the box spring, buy wood. So very often they're in wood. Or the other place I check, or my wife tells me to check because she's heard me talk about this enough, are picture frames or the headboard. The wood, for some reason, they like to hang out. But they can get absolutely staggering if you don't deal with them. And so it went from being somewhat a non-issue to I would get most of the cases coming in from relatively nice hotels. And again, being as smart as I am, I said, well, I wonder if that is people traveling. You know, these nice hotels, it's more likely people from out of country traveling and bring them in. Then they started to show up in multifamily housing units. And I remember the first day of feeling, oh, here we go, is a good friend of mine who's been in the pest control business for 40 years now, is very efficient. He was telling me about a story he was dealing on the south side of Madison. He had been in there 3 times to treat, and he couldn't stop them. And I'm figuring if anybody would be thorough enough to stop him, it would be he. And the only time I had that feeling before is when I had a mom that was a nurse treating her kid for head lice and said I followed directions, I couldn't kill the lice. And it turned out to be resistance to lice, which is very, very well known now. But same thing here, you knew something was going. So we've been investigating, and I've done some programs with some of the big researchers, a big research program out of Florida, a big one out of Virginia Tech, among other places. And I was on the program with one of the people from Florida, and he said, you know, this is all Bill Gates' fault. And I thought, oh, this is going to be good. Well, what he was arguing is that it turns out that one of the Gates Foundation's main areas of work is malaria control. And one of the ways that we are lessening people's exposure to malaria is giving insecticide-treated bed nets to people in Africa and India so that the mosquitoes can't get them when they sleep. Well, what we've got now is a low dose of insecticide in constant contact with the bed where the bed bugs live. So it turns out that they have resistance to the permethrin. And the resistance factor is the same resistance factor that the bedbugs use to get by DDT. They work in the same place in the nerve, so there's a reason why it makes sense. So they basically were resistant to our family of chemicals that won't be invented for another 30 years, is what turned out to be. So the standard things that people use to kill bedbugs don't work. And if you were to call me up and say, what can I buy at the hardware store, I would say, don't even bother, because there's nothing you can buy I have really any faith in. There's a little bit of new chemistry that comes up, and it looks kind of encouraging, but as far as it becoming widespread use, and even if it is going to work, for how long? I mean, the way nature works is you expect resistance. If you push them hard enough, it will come back, except the one way that we are having great success is with heat. Bedbugs cannot survive temperatures above 110 degrees. So the main way pest control firms now are dealing with this in hotels and the like, and then we've even now have bug sniffing dogs for hotels because they're far better at picking up the infestations before they get out of hand, is they go into these big heat machines and they generate 140 degrees ambient air temperature and they cook them out. And the bedbugs can't become resistant to that. The trouble with this technology is if you talk about the average, 1-bedroom apartment on campus, they'll charge between $800 and $1,000 to treat because of the time involved. I mean, they're not gouging people. They got equipment, they got hours of their time and labor to do it, and so it's a resource issue. You imagine you get a 60-unit apartment that's half infested. Who's got the resources? Even if you got the machines. I mean, that's what I hear from the public housing people in Milwaukee, is they've got 3 machines and I don't know how many thousands of units. They can't work fast enough to catch up to it. So I continue to expect this to be a frustration to some degree and the like. So it'll be kind of a stay tuned. My wife still hasn't forgiven me. I've been writing a book for about 5 years now, and I'm having fun writing it, but as any of you who have tackled something like that, it's kind of hard to finish it up. But she made sure that I tell a story about people used to drop insects off at my house, and I was more than willing to take a look at them if it was more convenient than bringing it down to campus. And of course, we know about campus parking, so it was probably easier for most people to bring it to my house. Well, somebody brought a little envelope and left it in our mailbox with live bed bugs inside. Took a little time, and I promised her I would explicitly tell people not to bring bed bugs to the house. There was also one night I came home, and there was a container on the front stoop with a great big rock with a black widow inside. That was even more exciting as far as she was concerned. So, different story. So, what I've tried to do is just talk about some interesting things, and I guess the general point is that expect to see new things continue to move in. The ones that'll probably get us the most excited are the non-natives because of their potential impact. We're all dealing with emerald ash borer. I didn't get into that story, but that's one that I expect to settle down in probably 300 or 400 years. The time frame is just way past what we can do. Most other things, what you tend to find is the introductions, they're pretty much unchecked. They cause the most damage, and then over time, things settle down. Gypsy moth brings to mind. My mentor at the university was Dr. Chuck Koval, which was the father of our present police chief. And Dr. Koval told me he wanted to retire before gypsy moth and Japanese beetle got into the state, and he did, and I never forgave him. But gypsy moth has turned out not to be near the impact as did out east. I mean, out east, when gypsy moth would have an outbreak, you wouldn't have an oak tree with a leaf on it for 150 miles. We have not seen that. In fact, it was interesting to watch a few years ago. They sprayed our neighborhood. They sprayed not quite to where I live. There was about 3 blocks away. They were over on Tokay. And when I was walking around, I found no difference between the gypsy moth caterpillar numbers where they treated, not treated, because it wasn't the spray that was controlling, it was a fungus disease that has now been the major impact. And as long as we have somewhat wet springs, the fungus will kill the gypsy moths. The only thing that would allow gypsy moth to really get going is 3 or 4 dry springs in a row. So probably likelihood isn't good. So that's one example that it kind of fizzled out, relatively speaking, by the time it got to Wisconsin. I find Japanese beetle has fizzled out, at least in my neighborhood. Not that it doesn't go, but the numbers are 10% or less of what it was in 2004, 2005. And that's the hopeful message I give when I get up to Wausau or I get up to Green Bay, where they're just in the early stage of this, that things will get better over time. But unfortunately, it's about an 8 to 10 year process. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions on this or whatever. Yes?
Why do things get better?
So, they talk about the balance of nature. Either natural things, and in fact, I love this about the gypsy moth story. Gypsy moth originally got in the United States from somebody who lived up in the Connecticut area, thought he could breed gypsy moth, which eats almost anything, with some of our wild silkworms. And he was trying to basically start another domestic kind of silkworm. Well, that's kind of like trying to breed sheep and pigs in the insect world, but the person didn't know any better. So the things got out, they started getting crazy. So back in the early 1900s, when they were getting to be problematic, they went back to both Northern Europe, Russia, and then eventually into Asia, and brought some parasites through, and they slowed them up a little bit, but they also brought a fungus disease with them. that was killing the caterpillars. They went out and took these dead caterpillars that were full of fungus, and they crumbled them up. And for the next 50, 60 years, no sign of any fungus disease. Then back in the late 1980s, when the population model suggests here comes gypsy moth because the conditions were right, they didn't take off. And they found out it was this fungus disease. So everybody got all excited, in fact, so excited that they took some of the sick caterpillars from out east and brought them to Wisconsin and crumbled them up thinking we'll have the fungus disease here. Great strategy. But now, even though our Wisconsin ones are controlled by a fungus disease, what we find out is the fungus disease that's killing them is not the same strain that was brought over here 100 years ago. It's natural here somehow. So that's what you tend to find. What's happening with Japanese beetle is there is a bacterial disease that are killing the grubs. And it just took time to get here to the point. And so what you tend to find, as I said, is something's going to move in. What you find in nature is anytime anything's doing really well, nature takes offense at that, I think. And something will come in to exploit that resource. And as I said, typically with other insects, parasites, or diseases, those three things come into play. No, that's a good question. I would again speculate it is probably more disease-wise than something big, because earwigs are real generalists. You know, they seem to do all kinds of things, and they cause probably more plant damage than people think. There's some varieties of marigolds that they'll make look like rabbit damage when they feed on it. You know, I've noticed that when I walked around. But we have not seen anything like we did back in the 80s. I mean, you still see them, but again, 10, 15% of the population. That one hasn't been studied. I mean, earwigs have been looked at for some other things. Fortunately, one of the things they feed on is monarch eggs and monarch caterpillars. So they've been implicated as a new predator into that system, although I don't think they're a dominant predator. They're just something that again, kind of confuses the system or goes up. But I think if somebody were to really look close, as I said, I would speculate something. The way earwigs work is they spend the winter in the ground as adult females. They partially raise their young below ground, and they come out as half-grown earwigs about Memorial Day. So it's usually the end of May. And what makes or breaks their populations in general is how moist it is. If it's real dry, they don't do so well. If it's pretty wet. But what I tend to find now is even if they come on gangbusters by August, their populations have just dropped off. You know, so still people don't like them in their house, but not near as bad as it used to be. Yes?
I came back from Brazil with chiggers.
Okay.
I know they're arachnids. I don't know.
They're little mites. In most of the chiggers we have here, okay, she came back from Brazil with chiggers. Now, I'd get the questions quite commonly about chiggers in Wisconsin, and we do have them. They're not near as common. They're more common south of us. But what they are little parasitic mites. In fact, many of them are parasitic on insects. So we are a non-host. That doesn't stop them from burrowing in. And so what happens when they burrow in and feed, most of the time they've already left you. But all that debris that they left behind, your body does not like, and so you overreact. It's basically an immune response. So all the itching and weeping and characteristic around the belt line and other sock line is 2 or 3 days after you've been exposed to them. And I, interesting enough, my wife is quite susceptible. We have been in the picnic in the same blanket. She's gotten chiggers, I haven't. So apparently they don't like pelletiries, but that's, I probably don't react to them is what it is. So it's unfortunate, but again, by the time you discover it, other than to deal with the symptoms, don't worry about critters living in you, because that doesn't.
I wondered what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I knew they went under the skin, and then what did they drop off, and they're all over?
So part of it is some of the salivary components that they're leaving behind that you're reacting to, some of their waste and the like, but that's all it is. So your body's,
Right, and then they get out again?
yes, because we're not what they like. They don't like the way we taste. So, and then the other thing, of course, is, as I think we all know, we're a little cautious on the internet. Chiggers, if you just do a thing on chiggers, I think it'll be straightforward. The one that used to drive me absolutely crazy was another parasitic mite that we run into are bird mites. If you have a robin's nest outside your house, there are mites that will bother the birds, and when the young birds fly off, the mites get a little bit hungry and they will migrate in the house and they'll bite people. Nothing serious about it. If you go on the internet, there's a place, the #1 site that comes up, birdmites.com, where the person will tell you they get in your house, they'll be there forever, they'll never go away, and they'll burrow in your skin. And I mean, just the most terrible, Stephen King-like horror story, and none of it's true. You know, you pick the bird nest, you get rid of it, you vacuum, you're done. I mean, that was the reality. As I said, if you're not careful where you get your resources from.
10 days, very, very
Yes.
itchy.
And that's kind of classic chiggers. Anybody that's experienced it, you don't forget it, because it often, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, still itchy for people. But the good news is there's nothing left behind. As I said, you're reacting to more of the debris, and your body just has to kind of process it, I think, more than anything else.
Oh, I wondered
Yes.
whether they were going to crawl out and...
No,
Okay.
nothing to worry about, thank goodness. Yes.
So the stink bugs, why are they coming into the house and what's their life cycle?
So they overwinter as adults in sheltered sites. So the question about the stink bugs, why they're coming in the house, winter rent-free. And you notice it's not a good strategy from their part, because when they do wake up, there's nothing to eat and like. And this is the same with Asian lady beetle. We get very high mortality because they're waking up when it's not the right time. But we're at that point of time now that they're trying to move outside. Go through 2 generations a year. As I said, we have not experienced, but I expect to see more and more damage on our soft-skinned fruits and vegetables from the feeding. And because it's an insect, again, I think they're injecting yeasts and other things in as they feed, and that's what's causing the discoloration in the problem. In the apples, you notice there's a callousing reaction to the feeding that's going on. In Pennsylvania, this is about 5-6 years ago, they said they lost about 40% of their apple crop to stink bug feeding. Yes?
Yeah, last summer I lost almost all my peppers to the stink bugs.
Yeah,
And
that's,
some of my raspberries,
yeah, the raspberries too,
which also had the spotted
winged Drosophila.
stuff.
Yeah, it's become a difficult plant to grow. That's the unfortunate thing. But as I said, I expect more and more, and so we're going to have to keep our guard up for stink bugs, and in particular, again, as the fruit is starting to more than halfway develop, I would think that's when they're going to start to see the assault coming on.
What do they look like?
They're shield-shaped. Now, the adults tend to be that brownish color. The nymphs or immature stages are a little bit brighter. And the bad thing about the nymphs is because the eggs are laid in a cluster, usually you've got a cluster of nymphs feeding on the plant, whereas the adults are mobile and can fly back and forth. So, we often preach, most of us that are gardening are out there, bothering with your plants every 3 days at least to take a look at them. Well, you just got to look a little closer now, because if you see the critters, then you can intervene. Might even have some success with soapy water sprays for the nymphs. I'm not that optimistic on the adults. The problem with soaps is that if an insect is thick-skinned, it doesn't get through their skin to kill them. But if an insect is soft-bodied, the soaps are pretty good. So that would be something to watch. Yes? No. In fact, the biggest question about emerald ash borer this past year, there was a study about 4 years ago done up in Minnesota that said that temperatures below 30 below will cause quite a bit significant mortality. And when the study first came out, I said, that's great if you live in the UP, but probably not so much for us here. If I had to venture a guess, it wouldn't surprise me if it would slow down a little bit. But, watching it in the Madison area, even 2 years ago, I could drive into parking lots that had ash trees. Now, that's not the best place to grow things, but ash will grow there. And I was seeing dead trees from ash borer. So what the advice is for high-value trees in people's yard, you should be treating if you're in the Madison area now to preserve those trees. If they are not high-value trees, expect within the next 5 to 7 years that the trees will be killed. It's going to be just like Dutch elm disease. I mean, as far as the visual effect as it's moving through the city. And as I said, I've definitely seen trees die, and of course the city is trying to combat that by, evaluating trees in removing as many trees as they can, even uninfested trees, trying to slow the movement, but that won't stop it, it will just slow it. So, yeah, Jerry.
I think Pennsylvania and maybe other states thought they had an ash species tolerant, if not resistant to ash borer. Is anything likely to evolve?
Oh, definitely. You see, that's why I think if you look, most of my insect cycles go 10, 15 years to settle down. Well, the way woody trees go, it's much more extended. There will be resistance. There's no question. There's resistance in the country of origin. This is like bronze birch borer is. It only attacks trees under stress. It only attacks trees under stress in Asia and the like. But our trees have no natural resistance. So until we see that come in through the line. So I think there is some hope, but not in my lifetime.
Even less mine.
We're not that different. Yes. So my first is I remember the calls on Larry Mueller of people saying, I don't kill as many bugs on my car windshield as I did when I was a kid. And again, we're kind of thinking, well, maybe it's the design of the car's got a little bit to do with this, and maybe it's because of land use change. And the guy says, well, I live in Bayfield. It's the same as it was. What I think they were witnessing is the same thing. And I've witnessed this too. I remember, again, it's my memories as a kid, but looking at a street light in July, and just the literally thousands of moths and bugs flying around and whatnot, you don't see that anymore. And so aside from that original study, as people have looked into it, there's a similar study of a gentleman that had done in Puerto Rico in one of their native jungles. And again, has about a 30-year time frame, and things are just dropping off 60, 70% as far as biomass. And as people are looking in more places, and so people are trying to get a better grasp. There's definitely a climate factor. There's probably a pesticide factor, like so many things. It's complex. I'm staggered. I mean, it is incredibly unsettling. On the other hand, the realities of the world, because we don't seem to pay much to any science, let alone insect science. I'm not sure it's going to get people's attention, but boy, should it, is kind of where, as I said, and I've seen a couple other people come out, well, it's not as bad as it seems. Well, it does kind of feel that way. As I said, when I just look at my experience with insects, the kind of things, there's a whole bunch of things that just don't seem to be there, or the biomass. So if the biomass is there, we've got bird problems. I mean, there's just, the whole food web is going to pay for it. So it'll be kind of a stay tuned, but it might be one of those things that and even again, that study in Germany, that was pretty much undisturbed ground. It wasn't as if there had been major land use changes that you could blame that. If you got 6,000 acres of soybeans and nothing else is growing, that's kind of an ecological desert, but we're talking places that have a much more stable environment that should have much more stable insect populations. It's a defense mechanism. They literally have stink glands in their abdomen. In fact, if you turn them over, they look like little discs. And they are foul smelling and foul tasting to have birds and other things that might potentially feed on them, leave them alone and learn that they are distasteful. Which is the same with Asian lady beetle. If you bother Asian lady beetles, they bleed through their joints and their body fluids are very strong smelling. In fact, people even develop allergies to that. We've had some health issues with it. And again, it's a defense mechanism. There are some insects, the question about stink bugs, if you crush them, can they do some things? When you crush an ant, ants communicate with a lot of chemicals, funny things happen. Same with wasps. When a wasp stings, they go off alarm chemicals that get things. But stink bugs, I don't know of those kind of interactions. It's just an individual defense mechanism rather than having a broader biological purpose that I understand. I used to love this time of the year, a little bit later, Memorial Day, that the newspapers, the TVs and whatnot would come to give the mosquito prediction every year. And what I would tell them the same every year is that, it depends on rainfall patterns. So the first thing about this particular year, we've had enough flooding that this is a case that I can correlate winter activity. The amount of flooding is going to push some mosquitoes, and we have 55 verified species in the state, but the biggest problematic ones are floodwater mosquitoes. And what's so interesting about their biology is they will lay eggs on the edge of a flooded area. If that water level goes down, those eggs will remain dormant for years, 4 or 5 years, until that refloods. So this year, we're flooding a whole bunch of areas that weren't, so that tends to kick up mosquito habitat short run. But after that first wave, it all has to do with flooding rains or the lack of flooding rains. So I always say blame it on the weatherman. So again, going back to the press, you'd say, I tell you the same story every time. It isn't going to change. You know, there are some rules. The first snow, we talked to the snowplow guy. You know, we got to talk to somebody about mosquito bites. So I understand that. But as I said, it's pretty easy to predict. It's about a 10-day pattern in the summer from the flooding to the first wave of mosquitoes, and it's about a 4-week process to get that population to drop down. But we have mosquitoes that are capable of taking advantage of that continually. So you can have multiple waves if the weather allows. Most of the time it doesn't happen. And once in a while it will get so wet that it washes out the breeding site. So I've seen that too, where reoccurring rains prevent them from giving enough time. But what's so interesting is the biggest problem areas are temporary water that isn't a stable environment. Because if you think about a drainage ditch by a highway, no predators, no parasites, it floods, the eggs hatch in 2 to 3 days, the adults are off in 10 days. They're out of there before anything can show up. If you show me a pond with frogs and fish and whatnot, I don't worry about mosquitoes. It's those darn temporary flooding situations that get us in the biggest trouble. But then they migrate. We can document the mosquitoes in Madison from spring green sometimes. You know, they will come 10, 15 miles. In fact, my colleague Bill Hilsenhoff one year correlated the problems down in Champaign-Urbana from the flooding up in southwest Wisconsin. Now, that's unusual to have it that far, but with the prevailing winds and whatnot, he could prove. And they were in a dry spell, and we weren't, so it shows you how crazy it can get. And why mosquitoes are so hard to control, because you're dealing with such a big geographic area.
Tell us about that guy.
So in the scheme of things, when we talk about grasshoppers, most people think of the little shorthorn grasshoppers. But there's another whole family that's called the longhorn grasshoppers, the katydids and their relatives. So these are those big green green grasshoppers. Shorthorn grasshoppers, they have short antennae. These katydids, their antennae are as long as their bodies, and their bodies are 2 inches long. The fun ones they're very territorial. They live in trees, and they sing at night. It's kind of a rattle. It's not really quite a chirp. And so people will have them out in a tree, and they're very hard to find as well as they're camouflaged. So I used to get the calls of people that these things would keep them awake at night, and they were very concerned about that. How you're going to find one green katydid in a 35-foot tall oak tree, I don't know. And they will keep going well until October or so. What it is, the males are both advertising, I live in this tree, and I would like to find a mate, but also telling the other males, this is my tree and you stay away. So usually what you hear is 2 different trees, and they're kind of rattling back and forth. Where I hear them every year is the corner of Midvale Mineral Point Road and just up from Westgate. We used to have a university farms there at one time. We were even honestly thinking of making a horticulture station right on the corner. There were some plant displays there. Now it's all part of the research park. But that tree line in there, every year, the fall of the year at night, if you drive around with your windows down, you'll hear the cicada, or I mean the katydids up in the trees chirping. So, Whitney Way, yes. I knew it was a W, and it just, you know, how the brain works. Yes. Yes. No, that's not a problem. You know, it's interesting. In the scheme of things, cockroaches are less of an issue control-wise now than they were when I started, basically because of some of the baits and other refinements they have. Now on campus, the weird thing is that we have some of the biggest, meanest looking roaches you've ever imagined in the steam tunnels. And they are technically called American roach, but native to a lot of the roaches are native to North Africa. And they need a tropical environment. So most of our buildings and housing and whatnot, honestly, is a little too cool and a little too dry. But when you've got steam tunnels, so we have trouble on campus when you have, especially a drain that should be capped with, you know, most drains have a trap with water in it. If that dries out, the roaches have a very easy time of coming up and invading. And so when we run into problems on campus, that's what it was. It was usually a breach in the trap. Or the other thing that we found in a couple buildings is when they were doing reconstructions, they would cut plumbing and then forget about it. And then they would put a new wall in. And all of a sudden, we got a hole in that wall, and if the roaches find it, and if you're finding roaches during the day in offices and laboratories, you can only imagine at night what's going on, because they really are more active at night. So, that's always been a problem. Now, if you go back far enough, they used to blame entomology when we were in King Hall. It even predates me, that this was all our fault. I guarantee you, we were not raising cockroaches at that time, at least that species. So we were not guilty in that, but very unique. And the other place I have seen those on is on Regent Street. Apparently, this is the way, again, the heating tunnels. And the other roach that's on Regent Street is the Oriental cockroach, which is often referred to as a water bug. It's a black species, about half the size of the only place I know to find Oriental roaches in Madison is there was a building, I probably shouldn't say the name, basically a restaurant doing some remodeling, and when they lifted the floor up, there was a crawl space underneath it. You don't even want to know. People tend, we're all kind of freaked with roaches. And what's disconcerting about them, if you read about them, there's been 70, 80 different species of bacteria and viruses and other things. If they're crawling around in unhealthy places, they can physically pick it up and transfer it that way. And so that's why they are a public health concern. But that's potential. It doesn't mean just because you see a roach that there should be a concern with any of those things, really. Possibly. Especially the sprays they're using nowadays tend to have some repellency to them. And honestly, if you've had somebody come, okay, fine, spray has its purpose, but the better technology has been the development of very specific baits for roaches. And the baits are using less toxic products, far less insecticide, and they're not repelled by if they're made correctly. The only problem with baits is roaches don't go very far. You have to put the baits in front of them. So if the infestation's on this side of the room and you bait on this side of the room, it doesn't do you any good. So you have to be very thorough. It's a lot of hands and knees type stuff. But my experience is that is a better technology and probably more likely to be effective. Now, there's also a people concern about roaches in that some people are more tolerant. We have that trouble in apartments that, one person will get a pretty good infestation and not tell anybody, and it is proven. The same thing came up with bed bugs, is if you do nothing, that 20, 30% of the population will migrate out into new areas in a month's time. If you spray, there's even more migration. And so that's why you kind of have to surround them if you're treating areas. And so as I said, unless they can come up with some explanation, it should be dealt with and solved in a relatively short period of time. And if not, there should be an explanation why. We don't have the kind of roach problems. Down south, their roaches are living out right in everybody's yard. So they're constantly invading. So that's a whole different game. We have no native roaches that you have to worry about in Wisconsin. So we have all these domesticated species that you should be able to eliminate, given little patience. But by little patience, I'm talking 2 or 3 months. And if they're not solving it then, just coming and spraying the same place every month isn't going to solve the problem. It would have solved it originally if that was the problem site. So as I said, I think somebody should sit down and chat. Now, the other side of it, sometimes it's a communications problem. Probably legal for me to say, a cockroach was found in a yogurt container made in Babcock. This was years ago. And of course, everybody got quite excited. And so they called the entomologist over, because he just is across the street, and I walked around with the pest control. Well, the first dilemma is that he could only come at very short periods of time. But the more important part of the story is there were 2 rooms that he wanted access to. One was a student laboratory, and every time he asked, nobody would let him in. And the other one was this mysterious door in the basement. So when we finally got people around, we went and we started opening up doors. When we got in the student laboratory, if we would open any of the student doors, there were roaches in there. You know, they were feeding on various things, you know, agar and things that they had in the laboratory, and he could never get access. But the worst was in the basement. We opened it up, and at one time it had been a garbage room, and there was some food and stuff caked on it, and the roaches basically had been there undisturbed for months, and they were migrating up into the production facility. If somebody would have listened to the pest control person originally and given him access, he could have solved it. He gave up. After 3 or 4 months, he said, they don't listen to me. And so there's as much a people problem there, a communication problem. You know, and that's often, as I said, so the same thing here. If things aren't getting solved, is that what's going on? Is somebody's not listening, or is the pest control service not doing the job they should? We haven't yet. And, you know, they'll move to a different room, and that's usually sufficient. For people that travel a lot, they sell suitcase ovens. Very effective. You come home, you put your suitcase in it, you zip it up, you cook them for 3 hours, you put it up, nothing could survive that. So, you know, there are some physical things. The other thing I'll tell you what we do is we store our luggage in the bathtub. There's no bed bugs in the bathtub. Bigger chance of getting it is taking the luggage and you push it underneath the bed. That's a real no-no. I mean, because that's the more likely of them coming in. And they're not as contagious as some people think. On the other hand, when the populations get very high, you know, I've talked to social workers and whatnot, is if I brought a purse or something into a heavily infested place, I'd want a plastic tub to put my purse in and close it up, and maybe even take my shoes off and store them in a plastic tub. It's not out of the realm of possibility when they get really high populations that they show up in a bunch of places, but it's not common. We've had more problems in ambulances and other things when they're transporting people and they get bed bugs on, you know, the equipment and the like, or hospitals have a stinker of a time in emergency rooms and in particular in intensive care. You know, you got a restricted area, you got all this machinery, and then of course in the hospital the trouble is you take that machine that might become infested and you move it to the next room. So they have gotten now very extensive protocols on how to deal with these things and wall things off, get it treated right away so that we don't run the risk of it. But boy, in the early part of this game, it was quite common. By the time you discovered the problem in a hospital, you had multiple floors and multiple places infested, and it really was a challenge. Okay, well, thanks for your attention. I much appreciate it.
I'll just show it. We have a gift for Phil from the Retirement Association, a reversible umbrella, and we thank him very much for his talk.